Good morning. Shalom, salam alaikum. And you all heard some reggae, so I'll add in how you keeping. And I hope you all keeping well. I'm invited here for a variety of reasons. Some of it emerged out of a conversation I had with Kenneth Best, who edits one of the papers around UConn. And it was about the blog, Black Issues in Philosophy, which I founded, and with a team of students here, we edit. And that is connected to a lot of what my work has been about throughout my career, because in the interview, I brought up the fact that although some of us may receive a lot of attention, the purpose of the blog is for things that people may overlook, things they may not see, things they may not hear, communities who could be rendered invisible, or what this context, this forum has been calling the ZeroSum. And within that framework, I brought up the question of the importance of commitment, which is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about invisibility. And I'm also going to talk about, at the end, love notes. But to begin, the context in which we talk about this issue of invisibility is a very strange one, or even the zero sum. Because a lot of the people who are being called zero sums or invisible have to be identified and then being informed or told they're invisible or zero. So you have a form of bad faith at work. You have to say they're not really there, but then you have to find them and then say they're not really there. Now, this kind of a phenomenon is connected to something that has emerged in what I call the Euromodern world. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it because there's not enough time here, but the short version is what the Euromodern world has done in its concept of modern, because there's actually been many moderns. But what modern is about is to say there's a future, and in that future, some people belong to it. Now, if you really think about it, if some people belong to the future and some people don't, then in the present, if you have no future, then what is the status of your present? And if that's the case, what is the meaning of your past? In a way, you become retroactively delegitimized if you don't have that future. And that is the context that sets the kinds of invisibility I'm going to talk about. Now, the invisibilities are four kinds. There are many others, but I'm just going to focus on four kinds because there's limited time. The first is going to be the invisibility of quantity, and that's linked to racial invisibility. The second is going to be invisibility of time linked to land, and that's indigenous invisibility. The third is going to be invisibility linked to voice, and that's specifically connected to women. And the fourth is how these all come together around knowledge, which is linked to something like an American Philosophical Association blog on Black issues in philosophy. So the first, I'm just going to get to the point. The first, when there's racialized invisibility, is in effect to say those people should not be seen. So seeing them elicits a certain response. In effect, if you see them, there's always too many of them. And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I taught at a very big Midwestern public university in which there were more than 3,000 white faculty. There were about 70 Asian faculty and a whopping huge number of all 14 black faculty, okay? And the black faculty had a tendency to teach exactly next to, park exactly next to where they would teach, and immediately after teaching, they would get to their cars and they would leave. But I decided, since I'm out there in this Midwestern university, I wanted to meet the community. So I scheduled my classes on opposite sides of the campus, and I would, after teaching one, walk across the campus to my next class. And as I would do this, eventually, what began to pop up in the student newspapers and in conversations were talks about affirmative action. Talks began to emerge about, is it really possible for a white faculty member to get a job there anymore? Talks began to emerge about, it got to the point of the deluge of black faculty taking over the institution. Now, I remember when I was seeing this, I thought, but there were only 14 of us. So I began to wonder, and then as I began to read it, I began to realize whenever I would walk across the campus, I didn't see other black faculty. When I would walk back, I didn't see others. So I realized, oh, they were talking about me. See, when I walked across the campus, they saw something they shouldn't see, a black faculty member. And that meant that day they saw one too many black people in positions of legitimacy and authority. And then when I walked back, you know what that meant? That day they saw two. And I thought, man, this black stuff is potent. And so within that framework, there's this problem of quantity. And if you look at the logic, and it's not just about blacks, but I'm just using blacks here because the racial discourse in this country is so black obsessed, I'll refer to blacks. Black people are always too many. There are too many black people having children. There are too many black people in every direction. The many time you bring up black people, the first thing people want to know is the numbers. Okay, I create a Center for Afro-Jewish Studies. There are black Jews all over the world, but the first interview is, how many are there? Okay, so that's one. The second type is linked to this question. You see, all around the United States, if you look at this campus, all around the place, there are vestiges, there remains, echoes of the indigenous or First Nation populations. But this is a settler society. And as a settler society, it treats the future as settled. And if the future is settled, it means that the absence of the indigenous or First Nation people here, and their being linked to the land, means the envisioning of the future land is a land without them. So in effect, what happens is a form of invisibility that's linked to the idea that you could only be legitimately a Native American if you belong to the past. And if you think about what people call things that belong to the past but are in the present, we tend to use the language of haunting. In fact, if you look at it, the language of haunting eventually is the language of ghosts. So what happens is, although Native Americans are here we are, here they are, they'll say they're there, there's an over-spiritualizing of Native Americans. And the moment you would think about a spiritualizing, it is something at the level of national subconsciousness about the idea that to be a Native American is to be a ghost. And so the invisibility comes in, as many Native Americans have written about. One of the most famous is Vine Deloria, but there are others. For instance, there's a fellow in terms of among the Canadians, Glenn Coulthard of the Dene Nation. And when we think of someone like Deloria, he's from the Sioux Nation. The idea is that you can only really, at a certain point in a world of certain legal structures, get land from people through transaction. And so a form of peoplehood is put on Native populations, but the condition is that they not be who they are. And so in effect, it's a projected, invisible Native American, one of fantasy, one of spirituality. The third, which is linked to the question of woman, is, and again, it'll take a while for me to get through, but I'm just going to cut through the chase. If you look at women's literature, throughout women's literature, a lot of women's literature talk about having a voice. There's in her own voice, a different voice, gaining her voice. Anna Julia Cooper, African-American intellectual from the 19th century, was a voice from the South. If you look even in myth, particularly in European myths and East Asian myths, but if you look particularly all the way back to people like Eurydice and Orpheus, if you look at women who approach Hades, it's always about silence and voice. And this voice thing is rather striking. For instance, one of the great examples is in the Grimm's brothers' Little Snow White. Because as you know, the queen, and by the way, they had to amend the story. The queen was originally her biological mother, but that was too much for the audience, so then they made it a stepmother. But the queen would go to a mirror, and she'll ask the mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And if you think about it, it's not like when you look in a mirror, you don't see yourself. So why was seeing herself insufficient for knowing who she was. But the striking thing is that she asked for the mirror to tell her. And so that voice of the mirror represents the authority. And this is known in Lacanian psychoanalysis as the sign through which language represents authority. Now, for our purposes, what's crucial is I've gone all over the world and used this example for going on, 30 years. And when I go all over the world and use this example, I always ask, what is the voice of the mirror? And what's striking is most people immediately answer, except on very rare occasions, and those very rare occasions have been recent for a variety of reasons, the voice of the mirror is always male. So in effect, what brings legitimacy to this woman, despite being a queen, is the voice of a male. And in many contexts, this becomes a very crucial issue to think through, because you see, if you think about what it is to be a member of a polity, to be in a political society, you cannot be political without speech. And without speech, you don't have a voice. But the tricky thing is, even if you speak, your voice is useless if you are not heard. So if you are seen in a way that makes you not seen, imagined in a way that makes you not reality, and if people just simply hear noise from you but they don't listen, then you're invisible as a voice. So all of these come together in epistemological invisibility. Because if you are to ignore seeing, ignore listening, ignore imagining, then in effect you're saying the knowledge offered by these ZeroSums, by these people, that knowledge doesn't matter. Okay? So I'm going to close with two reflections. The first one is how we think from the point of view of that ZeroSum. Imagine Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, the very famous abolitionist, ambassador, the very famous writer, philosopher. Frederick Douglass, when he was a child, he was born a slave. And as slave plantations did, they would separate the mother, the father. In this case, the father really wanted a distance because the father was the master. And the child would be sent to be raised to a point where the child could work. And Frederick Douglass, when he separated from his mother, is sent to a plantation that, when he was around the age of 7, was 12 miles away from where his mother was. His mother, learning of his being there, and she was a field slave, which meant she had to work from dawn till sunset. She would walk through the evening, through those roads of rural Maryland, through the difficulties, and you can imagine if she was she was basically at the will of whoever would catch her. She would endure all that to see that child. Now, one of the things anybody who has children know about children is it doesn't matter from a child's point of view if your mother's a slave, if your mother has to go away and work. It doesn't really matter. From your point of view as a child, you are simply abandoned. And so even though the circumstances may say otherwise, children with that abandonment issue see somehow that their mothers or their fathers have done something to them. But this woman does this for 6 months. She spends time with the child. She would lie with him. She would talk with him. In one case, she defended him against a very brutal house servant. And then after the 6-month period, she went away and he never saw her again because she died. Now, he wrote 3 autobiographies, but in the last one, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, he reflected very early on this woman. Because you see, he lived in a world where, as a ZeroSum, he was property. He was a thing. And what that world said to Douglass is that your only value in the world is as a commodity for a master. If you are no longer useful for labor or to sell, you are of no value whatsoever. You are a ZeroSum. Okay? However, this woman comes in, spends this time with him, And suddenly, a new conception of value is brought into the life of Frederick Douglass. This new conception of value is a value that says, yes, the world says you're a commodity. Yes, the world says you're nothing. Yes, it says all that. But this woman doing this said to that child, but to me, you are everything. She brings into that world the value of love. And love is a value that's of a very different, not love in the sense of sexual love or any of that. This is love that says the world is infinitely harmed if you are no longer in it. And this, as we know, bolstered Frederick Douglass. He had a sense of pride, and many of you know about who Frederick Douglass was because she brought in something. But you see, if we stop the story there, he could have also become a self-absorbed, full of himself, cocky enslaved person who says, yeah, they're slaves, but I'm better than other slaves because I am loved by my mother. However, Douglass understood something very important, and this is connected to the theme of heroes. Because you see, if the story ended at him knowing that he was loved, we would have the wrong message. The crucial issue that Douglass learned is that it was insufficient for that woman to love him. What was also needed was for him to develop a new kind of value. And the new kind of value was the value of valuing being loved by her. Because you see, in the world she is in, she was also a slave. And that world said slaves can't give value. It's more important in that world to be loved, so to speak, by the master, or the master's wife, or the master's white daughter or white son. And so the idea is, what's the value of being loved by an enslaved field hand woman? So, but the point at which he could learn to value being loved by her, that is the moment where Frederick Douglass changed into a revolutionary. Because at that moment, it linked him to understanding there's a whole world of people who offer value, who are elided and rendered invisible by a system that fails to see what they have to offer. And so we come all the way to today. Because if you think of Alicia Garza, one of the women who founded Black Lives Matter, what she said is that what she had written was a love note to the folks. She was talking about the revolutionary potential of a form of seeing that's a form of valuing. And this is something that goes across many communities, because you see, if you don't value being valued by those who are linked into the very question of challenging a system that tries to erase the value of people, then despite your efforts to help or to supposedly transform that world, you're in fact reinforcing its condition of human subordination, degradation, and invisibility. And so, when we get back to the question of knowledge, founding something like a blog, which has a community that speaks to the world today. One of the great things about blogs is they're open access, they can be accessed everywhere. One of the things we did right away was to make sure our very first issue focused on a philosopher whom we respected. And at the time, we didn't even think about it. We just knew her work was important. And it was a philosopher who's right here in the state of Connecticut. Her name is Donna Dale Mercado. And we talked about her ideas. We valued her ideas and her work. And it went full circle because last night I was at a dinner where one of the deans was there, and she actually talked to me about that blog. And it turned out, she said, that she found that her colleague thought she was a voice in the wilderness, that nobody was listening to her, that nobody's reading her work. But now she realized that sometimes when we sometimes see ourselves as invisible, there's a world out there that in valuing her and her work can value ourselves. And so, although we did not know when we founded it that our effort to make visible the previously invisible what we discovered in that process, such as Douglass reflected or Alicia Garza reflected, that our task as educators, researchers, our task also as community activists, our task as those who are fighting for the cultivation of dignity and freedom, that ultimately when we produce our work, just like the efforts of this meeting to get people together and hand it to people we may never meet, that knowledge is also a profound and important love note. Thank you.